Naman notes, naman notes, naman notes. Hello, everyone. The message I'd like to share today is titled The Two Levels of Buddhism, the practical level and the truth level. All of our great Buddhist masters and teachers, they're all expressing Buddhism at the truth level, the deepest, profoundest level of truth. But most of us, I would say the average person, is perhaps more interested in Buddhism at a more practical level. And we might ask questions like, will Buddhism help me to live a happier life? Will Buddhism help to ease my stress or anxiety? Will Buddhism help me to live a more meaningful or fulfilled life? So we ask such very practical questions. Some might even ask questions like, well, can Buddhism help to lower my blood pressure? Or will it help me to be more successful in business? Or maybe will Buddhism give me good karma for the future? So if we consider our pursuit of Buddhism at the practical level, and then when you have great Buddhist masters and teachers, and even we ministers maybe are talking about Buddhism at this truth level, then there can often be this gap, this disjointed gap between truth level message of Buddhism and practical level, not connecting. We have some wonderful contemporary Buddhist teachers that I think are trying to connect the gap, trying to merge the practical and truth level of Buddhism. Books like, for example, this book by Dan Harris, 10% Happier, in which he got interested in Buddhism initially through meditation, and then through meditation he found that it helped to ease his stress and anxiety. But then he went further. He wanted to know the philosophy, the teachings behind meditation, which led to his deeper study of Buddhism, which allowed him to live a 10% happier life. So some Buddhist teachers, like Dan Harris, is really addressing the practical level. This bestseller by the Dalai Lama, The Art of Happiness, also talks about Buddhism at the more practical level, that all beings want to be happy. So that's the approach the Dalai Lama is taking in his presentations of Buddhism. Shin Buddhism, or Jodo Shinshu, which I belong to and which is part of our Buddhist Churches of America, we might be a little bit behind in that sense of presenting the practical side, the practical level of Shin Buddhism. So there is a practical level of Shin Buddhism. But first I'd like to address what Shin Buddhism will not get you, what it will not get you. So Buddhism will not get you $1 million, or it won't help you win the lotto or something like that. But although Buddhism may not get you $1 million, it can make you feel like $1 million. See? It can fulfill your life such that you are the richest person on earth, even though you have very little financially. Another thing Buddhism won't do is it won't cure your cancer if you have cancer. But it can give you the spiritual strength to face your cancer, maybe even to embrace your cancer, such that instead of looking at your illness as sort of like an enemy, you embrace it. Now it is the very thing that is teaching you the precious nature of life. So that is where the practical level of Buddhism and the truth level, begin to merge, begin to merge. And I'd like to now give a very vivid example of the practical level and the truth level merging. And I'd like to share with you about a former member of ours at the Orange County Buddhist Church, the late Scott Morris. We lost Scott some years ago to ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Let me say a little bit about Scott. He was not raised a Buddhist, but he married a woman who was a Buddhist, and then he and his family, his wife and 2 young children, started attending Orange County Buddhist Church some years ago. Scott was then diagnosed with early stages of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. Now, ALS is one of the saddest, most tragic illnesses to get, because there's no cure. There's just no cure for ALS. If a person gets cancer, there's various treatments, maybe chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery. So there's some hope there of being cured of cancer. But if you are diagnosed with ALS, there's no cure. The best you can hope for is that maybe you have a slow developing ALS. Some people only live a year or 2 after they're diagnosed with ALS, and others might live 10 years, or even in some cases up to 20 years. But there is no cure, and eventually ALS takes your life. It's a very debilitating illness. It starts from your feet and works its way up your body. So first you cannot walk, and then eventually you cannot use your hands or your arms. Then as it moves further up your body, you lose the ability to speak. And eventually it takes your life when you can no longer breathe. So that's the nature of this very sad illness, ALS, which Scott had. So around that time, at the Orange County Buddhist Church, we created a support group called Living Through Illness. And this was to help individuals who had any kind of illness. And we would meet once a month, and people would share what they were going through with their illness. And Scott attended this support group regularly. At one of our sessions, Scott was a little bit sad, and he was talking about how most likely he would not be able to live long enough to be at some of the major events in his family's lives. He thought, well, I'm probably not going to live long enough to be at my son's high school graduation. At the time, his children were quite young. And he said, I'm probably not going to live long enough to walk my daughter down the aisle on her wedding. And he was expressing how sad he felt that he would not be able to be there at those events of his family's lives. So I thought, gee, what can I say to Scott that might help him at that time? So I suggested, well, Scott, he could still at that time write and type. So I suggested to him, well, why don't you, write a letter to your son that you want him to read on the day of his high school graduation? Why don't you write a letter to your daughter that you want her to read on the day of her wedding someday? So you can write those letters now, and years from now in the future, at those milestones of your children's lives, they can read those letters, and in that sense, you'll be with them. So Scott said, "Oh, that's a good idea," and he left that session. The next month, we had another session of our living through illness. And right away, at the beginning of the session, Scott said, "Sensei, I wrote something." So I thought maybe he wrote one of those letters, but instead he said, "I wrote a poem." And I'd like to share with you the poem that Scott Morris wrote. And it goes as follows. I have ALS, and I am grateful. I am grateful to retire early to be with my family. I am grateful I have family and friends that are so supportive and hopeful. I am grateful I can still walk and get around. When that is gone, I am grateful I can still use my hands to feed myself. When that is gone, I am grateful I can still breathe and laugh and feel. When that is gone, I am grateful I had a wonderful life. And when that is gone, Namu Amida Butsu. I think this is just a profound poem that Scott wrote. I put it right up there with any of the famous Shin Buddhists that have composed wonderful poems like Myokoning, like Saichi, and others. See, for Scott, Namu Amida Butsu is not just a word. It's not just a recitation. It's a profound truth. He was able to encounter and receive Namu Amida Butsu as a profound truth at the truth level. At the truth level. And although he's facing this terminal illness that's going to eventually be so debilitating, he won't be able to walk, then he won't be able to use his hands, then he won't be able to speak, and then he won't be able to breathe, and it will take his life. But even beyond that, when that is gone, Namu Amida Butsu. So he touched something timeless, something very profound in the here and now, in his life here and now. And that, to me, is a very vivid example of practical Buddhism and truth level Buddhism now merging and connecting. So initially, we might be interested in Buddhism at this very practical level, but if we continue on the path, we too can encounter it at the truth level. That is our task, that is our challenge as a Shin Buddhist to follow the path of the Nembutsu and come to receive and encounter Namu Amida Butsu, not just as a word, not just as a recitation, but as profound and deep truth, something that is timeless, that even goes beyond our life and death. Thank you very much for listening to my message today.